C'est à moi le plaisir et l'honneur de faire la présentation de Claudio Paolucci aujourd'hui. Alors, évidemment, on est très heureux d'accueillir Claudio Paolucci, qui est professeur ordinaire de philosophie et de théorie du langage au département de philosophie et communication de l'Université de Bologne, où il enseigne la sémiotique et la philosophie du langage. Il est aussi le directeur du Centre international d'inactivisme et de sémiotique cognitive, le coordinateur scientifique du Centre international des sciences humaines Umberto Eco, et il a été récemment élu président de la Société de philosophie du langage. On le félicite. Depuis 2014, il est le coordinateur scientifique de l'école des hautes études en sciences humaines fondée par Umberto Eco, avec lequel il a travaillé, et précédemment, il a fait sa thèse et son mémoire à l'Université de Bologne. Depuis 2018, il est l'un des deux membres du comité de nomination de la Charles Sanders Peirce Society. En ce qui concerne ses projets de recherche, il est depuis 2019 principal investigator de deux projets européens, NEMO et Fake Spotting. Le premier est sur l'autisme et le second sur les fake news, l'énonciation et la vérification des faits. Depuis 2019, il est le chef d'équipe de l'Université de Bologne, pour l'Université de Bologne, du projet européen Meme, moi et les médias, Fostering Social Media Literacy Competencies Through Interactive Learning Sets for Adults with Disability. Depuis 2019, il est Visiting Fellow à l'Université d'Oxford. Il a été invité dans des centres de recherche prestigieux, non seulement à l'EHESS, mais à Memphis, en Pologne, etc., etc. Et il a été Resident Fellow de l'Institut américain pour la pensée philosophique et culturelle. Il est co-directeur de la revue Versus.
Je suis vieux, c'est ça.
Et éditeur des revues internationales Nouveau Acte Sémiotique et Italian Journal for Cognitive Sciences. Il a publié 4 livres, dont Strutturalismo e Interpretazione, en 2010, Persona, que Alessandro a montré tout à l'heure, et Cognitive Semiotics, que vous voyez là sur l'écran en 2021. Ces écrits ont été publiés par des éditeurs importants, prestigieux, tels que Routledge, Springer, Brill, De Gruyter, Drozd, Bompiani, Feltrinelli et Mondadori. Vous avez vu que les intérêts de Claudio et ses objets de recherche sont très variés et très actuels, et brassent de la sémantique aux sciences cognitives, ainsi que de l'autisme aux mèmes et aux questions liées à la formation aux médias. Je te laisse la parole, Claudio, et te remercie encore, avec Juan, d'être parmi nous, d'avoir accepté notre invitation.
Merci Maria Giulia pour cette présentation très généreuse. Pour moi, c'est un honneur d'être ici. Alors, je remercie Juan, je remercie Maria Giulia et toutes et tous pour être ici à m'écouter. Et je commence avec des excuses en quelque façon, parce que moi, je vais parler en anglais après. Alors, excuse-moi pour ça. Mais j'ai eu plusieurs raisons pour faire ça. Et pas toutes ne sont pas très heureux en quelque façon. Mais je veux dire que ce que je vais dire, que vous voyez, je crois que va se connecter à ce qu'Alessandro a dit en avant. Et c'est bien sûr, vous pouvez poser des questions en français après, etc. C'est pas de problème ça. Et c'est un peu lié à ce que j'essayais de faire avec mon dernier livre, qui essaye à répondre à la question comment on peut faire une sémiotique de l'esprit qui n'est pas psychologie, de quelque façon. C'est quelque chose qui est différent. Et bon, cette idée un peu, c'est l'idée de tenir ensemble 3 idées, c'est l'inactivisme, le pragmatisme et l'idée de material engagement, que l'esprit est étendu dans l'environnement, que la sémiose est inactive, que notre accès au non-état intérieur dépend de l'agency matérielle du monde. So I switch to English. So since I don't want to spoil somehow the book, if you will make me the pleasure and the honor to read it, what I want to show today, I think it's very close to the spirit of this series of seminar in Paris, is how this view can say something, I hope, that may be important for you on perception, thinking at perception is an inactive and diagrammatic process through priors and through interpreters. So perception is a kind of diagrammatic and active activity, and it's not a sampling or representation of the features of the word. That's the main idea. So we see that it's connected to what you told in the first two seances of the seminar. So my claim is that Alessandro was telling something on that before, that perception is a form of control hallucination, where with control hallucination, I mean the centrality of imagination for perception. That's my point. Perception is the product of imagination controlled by the word. And the way in which we match this production of forms through imagination, hallucination, with the control of the word is through diagrams. We'll see a kind of diagrammatic, embodied and disembodied way of thinking, and through narratives. So we see the idea of narrative as kind of narrativity of the mind. The main idea is that hallucination, so it's quite counterintuitive in some way, but I hope I can convince you. The main idea is that hallucination is the model of perception and not a deviant form of it, which is the usual view. With hallucination, I mean the morphological activity of production of forms of imagination, so it's kind of morphogenesis, which remains, and it's we had already had a question on that, and this activity remained crucial, central, both when it is not controlled by the word, right, as it in the case of hallucination, but also in the case of imagination or dreaming. The engine of perception stays firm in some way, which is, and it's grounded on imagination. And also the engine of perception is still imagination when the word controls it. Right? Perception is, online perception is when the word controls the morphogenesis of the imagination. Maybe the word hallucination can be misleading since perceptual phenomena thought under the edges of hallucination may seem in some way to lose that concreteness that I want to recognize for them. Huh? Maybe it is possible that figuration would have fit better with the ideas I will develop today, since there is no Sartrean derealization of perception. Huh? But I want to somewhere reveal my sources of inspiration that are Jan Kondrik, that Alessandro knows very well. This is a great scholar on perception, and Andy Clark. I mean, maybe you know the theory of the extended mind. What's the idea? The idea that we do not wait for the word. Our brains, our minds are active, and they try to guess what is out there. They try to anticipate what is out there, and to the extent that that guess matches the sensory data, we perceive the world. And for that, in Surfing Uncertainty, Andy Clark recalls the slogan coined by the vision scientist Ramesh Jain and Jan Kondrik, that perception is controlled hallucination. This is the direction I'm going to take. So I'll start. I want to start with the crucial problem of Kant and the platypus. of my mentor, which is not only my mentor, our mentor. It's a very pleasure to have here. Patrizia Maglio has been the very first pupil of Umberto Eco. So I want to come back to this because the problem of the book is how to perceptually interpret the platypus. How to construct the percept of an item of which I do not have the concept yet. That's the problem. How to account for what taxonomists do when they see a platypus, or for what Marco Polo does in front of a rhinoceros. You remember that when Marco Polo sees the rhinoceros in Java, he thinks it's a unicorn. Okay? So how to account for the bricolage of cultural units and previous knowledge that is at work when we try to adapt the schema to an unknown perceptual content, and then on the basis of the latter, readjust the concept so that it fits with the perceptual content. Think about what Marco Polo, who saw what we now realize were rhinoceros on Java, did. Since he had the previous knowledge of the unicorn coming from his culture, he designated those animals as unicorns. Then, as he was a honest chronicle, he hastened to tell us that these unicorns were rather strange, given that they were not white and slender, but they had, quotation, the hair of the buffalo and the feet like the feet of an elephant. That's why he advised us not to send a virgin girl to the rhinoceros like it was, to the unicorn like it was supposed the habit with unicorns. You know that almost the very same thing happened with the scientists when the platypus was discovered in Australia. A pult and a sketch were sent back to Great Britain by Captain John Hunter, and British scientists' initial idea was that the attributes were a hoax, really a bullshit in some way, believing it might have been produced by some Asian taxidermist putting together pieces of other animals, so they cut it together. So Marco Polo and the scientist interpret the rhinoceros and the platypus in a kind of top-down manner, trying to fit the percept into previous knowledge that used to predict and interpret what was in front of their eyes in some way. That's why the rhino was a clumsy and dark unicorn, and only later, on the basis of new perceptions that could not fit the previous knowledge, Marco Polo readjusted. No, okay, this is already done. Marco Polo readjusted the concept of the unicorn. And Eco says, sorry, I just, okay. While it can be maintained that semiotic processes, this is a quotation by Umberto Eco, are involved in the recognition of the known because it is precisely a matter of relating sense data to a semantic mode, the problem, which has been debated for a long time now, is to what extent a semiotic process plays a part in the understanding of an unknown phenomenon. Yeah? So as you can see, maybe you know this kind of literature, in Kant and the Platypus, Eco is somehow able to formulate with its own style a problem of perception, which is now at the core of the contemporary debate in theory of perception, cognitive sciences, and all that, which is the predictive process of the so-called Bayesian brain. Maybe you have heard about it, and you cannot go into a congress in psychology or cognitive science without someone who gives a paper on this topic. So in Andy Clark's predictive processes, perception in its rich word-revealing form, right? We're talking about the forms of the word, the one Alessandro was talking about before, the silence of the word somewhere. You know? Perception is active, and according to Clark, it works from the top down. The brain's key job is to predict the present sensory signal by constructing it for itself using stored knowledge about the word. So we do not wait for the word. We anticipate constructing the percept starting from previous knowledge, from interpretance, if you want to use Persian terminology. And we do that through imagination. In perception, the incoming sensory signal is matched by a complex flow of top-down prediction through imagination. In some way, cognitive semiotics and pragmatism we can say that share this view. Peirce used to tell that we cannot have any cognition without previous knowledge. We don't have any perception without previous knowledge. So interpretance was the cognitive semiotic version of the priors of the predictive processing by Andy Clark. It's just name of terminology, but the concept is quite the same. In 2022, we can say that as long as the matching proceeds, some populations of cell sends prediction downwards and others send residual error upwards. And when the top-down flow, the imagination one, sufficiently matches the sensory evidence, the system has unearthed most likely set of worldly causes that would give rise to the sensory barrage in some way. And the stable, word-revealing perceptive form is the very same thing that Alessandro was describing before when he's talking about the normal, non-heterogenetic way of moving from the virtual to the actual. But this is, in some way, this is a great discover that we have some kind of compression strategy that is called predictive coding. This is the name Andy Clark uses, because since the brain is already active, since he's busily predicting its own sensory input, and the result exists at every level of processes in some way, what we need to do is to bother only of whatever is escaping our predictive net in some way. So what needs to drive further perception is just the residual difference between an actual signal and some predicted one. So in some way, what perception carries on is only the news. So the idea is that they care only about the difference, only the news. This is actually Marco Polo's story of the rhino Umberto Eco was telling us. He didn't call it predictive coding, as it was using semiotic and pragmatism, but there is no big difference. So Marco Polo makes some kind of top-down bricolage with his previous knowledge coded in the encyclopedias, with his priors, in order to match the sensory data, and only when he sees that it can't work out with the concept of the unicorn, he thinks of constructing a new code for new sensory data inputs. Putting Andy Clark's word, you have a quotation here, we perceive a structure external world and not just pattern of light and sound. That's the idea that we tend to stabilize a figurative plane and not a plastic one in some way, because we meet the transduced pixels as a perception. The figurative comes before the plastic in some way, because we meet a transduced pixel with a top-down cascade of interacting represented distal causes. So the so-called transparency of perceptual experience, so the phenomenon that we see tables, chairs, and bananas and non-sensory intermediaries, seems to fall quite naturally out of this mode. So perception and understanding, according to Clark, are inseparable. To perceive like that is to guess how the sensory evidence was generated by means of interacting distal causes, and how it is likely to evolve on multiple spatial and temporal scales. Perceiving and understanding are thus co-constructive, and percepts are always at least weakly conceptualized. So we are coming to our problem, to the problem of the seminar, I think, because the relationship between the percept and the concept not only was the problem of Umberto Eco for the semiotic of perception, but according to Eco, the solution for him was a reformulation of the Kantian notion of schematism. And we start to get close to our problem. Why? Because, according to Kant, schematism is the product of imagination. And according to Peirce, schema, in the Kantian sense, is a diagram. That's what Peirce claims. So you have concepts that are somehow intellectual. You have sense data that comes from aesthetics, from theory, sensibility. But the art of making those two communicate in the perception is the art of imagination. And the art of imagination is a diagrammatic art. That's the point. So,
abbiamo dovuto togliere la presentazione, ma Claudio, che non giravano, se no.
ok.
Ti cancello questo, vediamo un po'. Oh no, ti volevo solo cancellare, hai capito cosa? Questo affare qui, clicchi. Mi capisci?
No.
No, vabbè, niente, dai, cerca di leggere lo stesso così, perché non possiamo fare altrimenti. Loro sì, la vedono, ma se la mettiamo in presentazione non la vedono.
Ok. Ok, so you
se vuoi lo
just
posso
get
fare
delay.
un secondo così, ma...
It's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. Then you can tell me something. I'm not...
puoi leggere.
Not at all interested in that, but... My point is that to explain this kind of art of imagination, which is a diagrammatic art, in Canto de Platypus, Eco talks about diagrams like flowcharts or calculators. You have a quotation here, so Umberto tells that in order to gain a better understanding of the concept of schema, perhaps we need to consider what the computer's operators call a flowchart. So the machine is capable of thinking in terms of if, then, go to. Given one operation at a certain juncture in the process, a possible alternative is produced, and depending on the answer that appears, a choice needs to be made. Depending on the new answer, it is necessary to return a higher node of the chart or proceed beyond, and so on. The chart is something that can be intuited in spatial terms, but at the same time, it is substantially based on a temporal course, the flow. In the same way, Kant observes that the schemata are based fundamentally on time. So you remember that according to Kant, a schema is the determination of time. In diagrams theory, space is much more studied if compared to time. Maria Giulia worked a lot on that, for example. But as far as perception is concerned, diagrams of time are crucial, as we will see later, when we will deal with the default condition of perception, that is to perceive the immediate future. What I will try to show that we do not perceive the present, perceive the future. Eco notices, but not metaphorically, literally. We see a lot of we have a lot of experimental data on that. Eco notices, I have another slide on that, I don't know if I can just move on the other one. Eco notices, this kind of schema in Kant was an image only in the sense of the build by Wittgenstein. You remember that Wittgenstein used to tell us that the preposition share is a kind of an image of the word. It was called a Bildungstheorie, it's a kind of build. Eco says, you know, according to Kant, Kant says that schema is an image, but it's an image in the sense of the build by Wittgenstein, according to which a proposition shares a common form of relation, that's the word, a form of relation, with the fact that it represents. But at the same time, it differs from it in nature, so they are kind of heterogeneous. It's a kind of heterogenesis. So there is a kind of common form of relation, which is not a common form, it's a form of relation, but there is a different in nature. If you have studied a little bit, if you may know the idea that is a root of the person conception of the diagram, you have exactly this kind of notion. And Eco noticed it, since at the end of his discussion on schematism, he inserts the Persian diagram of the sentence, every mother loves some child of hers. So you have it there, and you have exactly a logical image, a build, a schema in which aesthetic elements embody or realize purely logical relations in observable and manipulable tokens that share the very form of relation. So this has nothing to do with language, with the proposition, because it's a kind of an image, but it's in a Bildung that share the forms of relation. In her intervention at the seminar, but also in her previous book, Maria Giulia Dondero talked a lot about that, I think. But what I care about is the diagram displays sensitively so it embodies the same logical relations that are in its object, and make these relations observable. It's not enough. The problem is not that they are observable. The point is that they are experimentally manipulated. So you have some doing on that. You have to do something in order to perceive. You may know the old activist view that perception is correction or is a kind of action. It is totally against the ordinary view in cognitive science, while the perception is the input, then you have the computation, and then action is the output in some way. No, it's perception is a kind of action in some way, because it's a kind of doing. This is the reason why Peirce can say that the diagram is a schema in a Kantian sense. Why? Because according to Kant, the schematism of imagination did not consist in an image, but in a aesthetic relations, time-space relations that embodied or realized logical conceptual relations. This is a common sense experience. It's a kind of everyday experience. For instance, in the diagram of the hierarchical structure of the roles of a company, you see, you perceive the relations of powers between the people. That would take you a lot of time to discover through ethnography in the real world of the company. So kind of a diagram is a sign that displays features that remains only virtual in the object before the intervention of the sign and of the doing. And only the sign and the doing are able to manifest in some way. So kind of a diagram is a filter through which it is possible to perceive otherwise unnoticeable properties of the object. In the case of the diagram, the filter is a cognitive filter. Because according to Peirce, the diagram is a logical image or a schematic image. Of course, we can imagine, we are semantics, we can build a typology of other kind of filtering. We can have non-logical diagrams in some way. This is the kind of, to me, directional research, which is very important to work on. The idea is, in order to discover new properties of the object which are not directly observable without the sign must be manipulated. So according to cognitive semiotics, cognition must always pass through some sort of doing, like the manipulating of a diagrammatic analog in the imagination. So if you think that imagination is the engine of perception, you have a kind of manipulation of priors, of previous knowledge of interpreters. So it is somehow, maybe you have seen the movie, you've seen the Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni, you may have seen it. When you are in the park and the murder happens, exactly why you are there, you cannot perceive anything. However, at home, through the pictures you have shot there, through the manipulation of the picture, through the manipulation of the semiotic structure, zooming in, cutting in, you perceive things that you were not able to perceive while observing the world directly. This is why Peirce can tell us that there is something in the object that can be perceived and acknowledged only through the sign, and that only in the sign is directly perceivable. That's the idea, I think. When you read it, it looks like he's crazy, but if you think about it, he's a genius. Just like a Kantian schema, a diagram establishes a kind of commensurability between a heterogeneous system. And you've seen that Alex in some way anticipated this kind of idea. You show us this. It was a diagram. You really show this kind of building, these assemblies, this building of a commensurability between a heterogeneous system. But the way it does is exclusively through relations of relations. That was the idea. It's a kind of differential calculus. So it's relations of relations. So its way of functioning has nothing to do with figurative analogies in some way. This can be clearly seen if you look at the diagram of the proposition taken into account by Eco. So the diagram, the image does not look like the proposition. Doesn't look at all like the proposition. Okay? Why? Because the diagram embodies logic relations, presenting them as observable and perceptually manipulable tokens, which is why it functions as a schema. But it does not look like a proposition. And why? Because of the proposition, it preserves only the form of relation. And this is the idea that we have when we speak of the image of a function in some way. What is the image of a function? It's corresponded in another sense, in some way. Or when we say that the parliament is the image of the population, there is no figurative analogy. It's a kind of okay. So, if predictive coding is right, and it's right, it is through a diagrammatic imagination that the forms of sensory data are built into the transparency of our perceptual experience, where we seem to simply see tables, chairs, and bananas, and not intermediaries. More, perceiving and understanding are co-constructed in some way. Not only percepts are always conceptualized, but logical relations are seen. There is a common view, you see, I have the quotation. There is a common view by Persian scholar that to me is totally unacceptable. So they keep on telling that perception is inferential. So there is inference in the forms of perception by person is inferential. It's totally the opposite. It's inference, this perceptive in person. We have a quotation, so you can read it. Every addition or improvement to our knowledge of whatsoever kind, every addition or improvement of our knowledge of whatsoever kind, come from an exercise of our powers of perception. So if cognition is inferential, it means that it comes from perception. In necessary inference, my observation is directed to a creation of my own imagination. Now you see the person gets it perfectly. A sort of diagram or image in which are portrayed the facts given in the premises. And the observation consists in recognizing relations between the parts of this diagram, which were not noticed in constructing. So I construct the diagram. I think this is the focus of our seminar. But when I have already produced and built my diagrams, these diagrams can show me something that I could not notice while I was constructing it. All the artificial intelligence was like that. The machine works in a way that even who programs it does not know why it works. Okay? I would say even more radical and say that the diagrammatic schematism of imagination is completely unrelated to any figurative analogy between the schema and its object. It works much more like a computer does when it builds up the image of Leonardo's Gioconda from a totally non-figurative flowchart code, which is exactly what the computer does. Maybe you remember Matrix. You remember when the computer guys used to see girls and bananas looking at what other people could perceive only as a code. There is the guy that used to look at the screen and here there was a code, but you see there is an egg girl there. So the idea is that animals like us, we have an evolutionary advantage of that. Animals like us can use stored knowledge and regularities of the environment. I'm a kind of an activist, to generate a kind of virtual diagrammatic analog of the driving sensory signal as it unfolds across multiple layers and types of processing. So the idea is that our perception works in the way that we can build the percept starting from priors through imagination. This paves the way for processes able to form and evolve in the absence of the usual sensory flow, like dreaming, for instance, where you have this kind of production of without the control of the words or imagination. And that both have the same form of relation of line perception. So the morphological, the morphogenesis underlying the construction of the forms are the same, exactly the same. This matters. Why? Because perception simply happens to the observer. The percepts are presentation, they are not representation. There being nothing to represent prior to the presentation. In other words, I said it more technically, to see or to perceive is an action of the Verstand, of the presentational awareness, whereas to look at things is an action of the Vernunft, of the discursive mind. And to blend the two is a kind of mistake somewhere. I don't know if I have a quick, okay, but anyway. This is very well done, well said in a book by a colleague, Italian colleague, you may know, she's called Liliana Bertazzi. She worked a lot with Jan Conderi, but it's a pleasure to me to remember the works of Liliana Bertazzi, which was excellent. But the idea is that if the brain's key job is to predict the present sensory signal by constructing it for itself, using stored knowledge about the world, in order to understand presentation, we need to study the laws of imagination and not the laws of thought or the laws of the brain. So if we have a look at how imagination works during the ontogenesis, we see that around 9 months of age, babies start to build words which are alternatives to the ones they are living in. Through imagination and strategic behavior, they start to build situations which are decoupled from the actual situation they are living in. They start to imagine fictional words, and more importantly, Luigi Basso works a lot of this passage through the fictional for cognition. And more importantly, they start working in order to make this fictional, imagined situation become the real, actual situation. For instance, they start to false crying in order to manipulate the mother. They were hungry, they used to cry, and then the mother arrived. They want a world where the mother is more with them, so they start to fast crying, not because they are angry, but because they want them. So through imagination, they bet that the possible world they have built according to their desires and to their values can be or can become through action, the real world. We will see that this kind of diagrammatic working of the imagination is crucial for perception. It's my last part. And we will also see that this process of matching the two words through a combination of imagination and action as a narrative form in a semiotic sense, the idea of semiotic narrativity. So it works like a story. It is, for instance, the key narrative process of detective stories. I will work a little bit on that later. So we work on 3 points, my last 10 minutes. First point is, what is control hallucination? Now we can really understand. The second one is the way this control hallucination is connected to perception. The third point is the connection between imagination and narratives in perception. This is what I want to do now. First point, with hallucination, I indicate a process of microgenesis that produces in a continuous way the next thread of perceptual experience, next thread. You are producing the next thread of your perception or a vision now. While the current one fades, and it fades beyond your voluntary control. What I'm claiming is that meaning guides this microgenesis of perception or hallucination. And that imagination is the engine of this microgenesis guided by meaning. So there is a connection between imagination and meaning in some way, in perception, okay? So what we perceive is literally and not metaphorically the future and not the present, because perception is the anticipation of the next thread of sensory information through previous knowledge, so that we build a diagrammatic analog with the same form of relation of the world that we expect. There is a wonderful experiment. I would really want that you read because it's great, by Adams and colleagues. It shows that in some circumstances you hear the presence of the absence. That is, you hallucinate something that is not there, but you expect it to be. You're under a machine that measure what you're doing. They are at a certain moment silence arrives, but you do not hear science as you are supposed to, because nothing is actually playing. And in the place of the silence, you hear the presence of the absent sound you were expecting to be there. Adams' experiment runs as follows. They use a simple computer simulation of bird song. A multi-layer prediction machine processes sequences of simulated bird chirps. The simulation were then repeated, but omitting the last 3 chirps of the original signal. The first missing chirp, the network responds with a strong burst of prediction error. But, which is the most important thing, at the precise moment where the first missing chirp should have occurred, the system, so our body, generated a brief, transient, illusory percept. This hallucinated percept was lower in intensity, but the timing was perfect with respect to the missing chirps. So it's a kind of difference in intensity, as you were telling before that. So it's really... Thus, in some way, our perceptive system firstly dimly perceived or hallucinating the missing chirps before responding with a strong error signal when the actual absence of the strongly anticipated sensory evidence becomes apparent. If you want a visual correspondence to the Adams experiment is the Canisters triangle that Alessandro worked a lot on that. If you see it, you all see the triangle, but the triangle here is totally your hallucination. It's the only thing that is not there. This is what I call perception as a control hallucination, which is the general functioning of our rich world revealing perceptual system at any level. And why? Because perception deals with an organism which is structurally coupled with its environment, trying to minimize disorder and surprise. That's what perception is for. Perception is not for to build a real image of the world. It's to minimize disorder and surprise in order to act effectively in the world. That's why I'm still a kind of an activist and pragmatist. So exploring the world, the organism casts its question to their environment through imagination, predicts its answer until he encounters resistance. And this action, it's a kind of problem-solving action, this action of casting questions in some way, turns the optical or the sound structure into data. But the data are not sent from the world to the organism through senses. But the data are the actual product of the autopoietic structure of the system of perception, because we are coupled, we are structurally coupled with our environment. So perception occurs when the top-down activity of imagination succeeds at generating the sensory data for itself. Doing what? Building a coherent story that paves the way for efficacious action. When it can generate a diagram of the future sensory data, that's what imagination does, we perceive the world. When we cannot generate a diagram of future sensory data and we encounter a resistance, what we do? We try a new attunement that creates data. we do a kind of diagrammatic manipulation, as in Peirce theory. Or, if it's needed in a more radical way, we try to change the world through action. Action is a way of changing the world, dealing with our perceptions, totally captured with their environment. I just want to let you show a little, that I want to show this one. If you can look at this one, it's very, very popular one, but just for want to familiarize with this. So in order to see at work this orthopoietic machinery of control hallucination, that occurs when the organism casts its question to the environment through imagination and predicts its answers until he encounters resistance. Let's see what happens in this scene in front of you. I leave you sometimes in order to familiarize with the image, but you will see here that not only perception hallucinates something, the cube in some way is the product of your hallucination, but what you see depends on what you look for and how you group elements according to what you look for. It's a kind of grouping activity according to Gestalt laws. Depends on the problems you are posing to the environment in some way, or the question you asked to it. Okay. So what you look for edges, because we had an evolutionary advantage looking for edges, because there was predatory, and so we look for edges. Even if there are not edges, we look for them, and we group elements accordingly. No, so the way what you look for and how you group elements depend on the way you are attuned to the environment. It's kind of attuned. So basically what you see there, you have no cube there, but even if you all perceive it, what you have there is a collection of black blocks on a gray background. But you are likely to see either one of two views of a cube. You see both cubes there. You can see it there, okay? But of course, many alternative interpretations are possible. The two cubes may alternate in time. You cannot perceive both at the same time. The interesting thing, if you see there, that you also see your own location, either above or below the cube. If you stabilize one cube, you are above. If you stabilize the other one, you are below the cube. Make the experiment. So it's the idea that everything starts from the body. The body can be tricked in some way because the problem is the structural coupling with the environment, and not the idea that you have a body that, in some way, as it has been told. But okay. So, in some way, what you have here is one of many possible presentations. You could have grouped the pieces in many other different ways, in infinity different ways. But you haven't. Some way, laws of Gestalt apply. You have looked for something, you have somehow explored in a bodily and haptic fashion the optical structure, and you have built a semiotic expression plan that conveys meaning, it is the cube, out of many other possible configurations that would have been totally meaningless for you. That would not have stabilized any expression plan out of the optical structure. In some way. This is not amazing at all. It's the function of our body. Why? Because the optic nerve is a channel capacity of 10 all'ottava, I don't know how to say it in French, 10 all'ottava, 10 alla decima beats per second, okay? Whereas estimates of the structural complexity of perception, Alessandra, you will, I think you will confirm them, are generally below 100 beats per second. So you have to some way pass from 10 all'ottava, 10 alla nona to beats to 100 beats. So perception has to be very selective. And what does the selection? meaning does the selection. So you cut in some way, you carve out a semiotic niche, a semiotic niche of values in some way. So you have to look for silent cues, you have build them in your coupling with the environment. And what is there if you don't looking for something guided by meaning? You have just an arrangement of gray and black with no edges at all. But you see edges and you see a couple of different cubes. Okay. And Jean Petitot would underline that we all picked up a highly non-generic and non-ordinary pattern in our searching for edges, because it's a kind of collinearity, parallelity, so there are only highly non-generic features of 2D projection or of 3D wireframe configuration in some way. But I don't want to go too technical here. But what I want to underline that this is actually only an arrangement of gray and black. That could have been grouped in many other possible ways. The cube is entirely your hallucination, and we all had it. Okay. So what you have done, you have in some way created your cube looking for something, exploring the world and turning optical structures into meaningful data. And how did you all do all that? Two moves. You have selected cues, turning them into clues. It's a kind of semiotic activity. And second thing, which is even more semiotic, you have built up a coherent story, a coherent wall, starting from the clues you have created, from the cues you have selected. This is why I will show now with my last slide. It is through narratives that we match the hallucination of imagination with the control of the world, giving birth to perception as controlled hallucination. The couple Q and clue is a key one for my work on perception, because Q, you know, means signal for action or hint or indication about how to behave in particular circumstances, or a piece of information that aids the memory in retrieving details not recalled spontaneously. This letter meaning is related to the meaning of clue, which is a clue. It's a piece of evidence or information used in the detection of a crime or solving of a mystery, or a fact or an idea that serves as a guide or aid in a task or a problem. This meaning is very of interest for semioticians, not only because it connects us to narratives and to semiotics, but because it hints at the fact that cues are selected. They're not coming from the world. This is also true of perception. Somehow the organism selects certain cues and ignores other cues. For instance, we were looking for edges, grouping elements accordingly, according to Gestalt theory laws. So in some way, the observer, the organ, selects optical structures and promote it to cue status. Jan Contri worked a lot on this point, it's great work. And then turn cues into clues in order to build a wall, a coherent story. And it's only this very double semiotic doing, this very double semiotic action that turns optical structure into meaningful data. And only when you do that, you hallucinate the cube. Such an idea is quite natural. If you consider the well-known Sherlock Holmes stories, throughout the story, Sherlock Holmes collects clues, you remember, which are most apparently irrelevant trivialities. But the important point is that the world offers an infinite number of equally trivial observations. And Sherlock Holmes selects ones that will become meaningful in order to construct a coherent wall, starting from the pieces at the conclusion of the story. As Holmes explained the case, all these apparently irrelevant trivial observations become very meaningful at the end. Whereas the infinitely many other observations that could just as well have been made are never even mentioned. That would be impossible, be boring, because they would be entirely meaningless in some way. No? What's the point? It's the point that it is only Holmes' explanation, Holmes' perception of the plot that renders the clues meaningful. Thus, the clues are necessary to construct the plot, and the plot as a coherent whole is necessary to be able to select or to create the clues. So we look for figures, so we create cues, but we create cues because we look for features. Because why? Because it's a autopoietic dynamical system. That's the point. So exploring the world, the organism casts questions to the environment through imagination and products its answers until it encounters resistance. When the imagination does not succeed at generating the sensory data for itself, it tries a new attunement that creates data. Imagination tries to build a possible world that bets to be the very same world of the actual real world as far as efficacious action is concerned. Perception is for action, is not for building a representation of the world. When the bet fails, it tries a new attunement or refines its bet on the structure of the world. Standing before an unknown, surprising event that requires explanation, our organism fallibly gambles that this event could be the part of a story it can create through cues and clues. If this is verified, thus discovering that this unknown event matches the coherent story we have built, that event thereby stops being surprising and stops being a resistance that requires new bets. It simply matches the stories we have built through imagination. So what's the point? The point is that narrativity is a gestalt property that shapes experience through meaning. And we use narrativity in order to build coherent walls starting from otherwise irrelated elements. So narrativity is a prior, if you want to say, if you want to use cognitive sciences terminology. Umberto Eco gives a masterful explanation of this aspect in his paper Horns, Hooves, Insteps, analyzing what allows Voltaire's Zadig to construct a normal story. It's a quotation by Umberto, starting from some surprising events and perceptions. Eco shows how Zadig could have interpreted the various visual utterances. The enunciation here is the word that Umberto used in Italian, that he has to do with, Zadig could have interpreted as a disconnected series or as a coherent sequence. And Umberto has, this to say, a text or a story. And he shows how it is only by interpreting the visual utterance as a text or a story that Zadig manages to make sense of his experience. Let's read Eco. Zadig decides to interpret the data he had assembled as if they were harmoniously interrelated, as if. It's our bet. He knew before that there was a horse and that there were 4 other unidentified agents. He knew that these 5 agents were individuals of the actual world of his own experience. Now he also believes that there was a horse with a long tail, 15 hands high, with a golden bit and a silver hoof. But such a horse does not necessarily belong to the actual world of Zadig experience. Zadig works like a baby that bets on a possible world closer to his own will in some way. Umberto says that it belongs to the textual possible world Zadig has built up. imagination is a word-creating device. So in the 80s, you already got it, that imagination is a word-creating device. So the for perception, of course, not for story in the sense of literature. Okay, so the dig is in a position to make a fair guess according to which both the horse and the dog of his own textual word are the same as those known by the officers. This kind of move is the one usually made by a detective. The possible individual I have outlined as an habitant of the world of my beliefs is the same as the individual of the actual word someone is looking for. So that's my conclusion. Eco says that behind this connection between imagination and narrative, this is the very core of Umberto Eco's semiotic thought. He says that behind this connection between imagination and narratives, there is a Kantian idea. We must interpret the world as if it were a story. It's a quotation. What is the Kantian idea? It consists of the fact that without our structuring it into story and into text, we could never have any knowledge or experience of the world. So we interpret the world as if it were a text of a story. It is to say, as if the possible structure we have delineated with our imagination is the same one that is constitutive of the real world. Even if this should not be true, and this is the predictive error part, it is the only way in which we can have fallible experience of it, trying to predict what it does not match. That's Umberto Eco's thought. Even if it was my mentor, I don't know if I would put things in this Kantian way, like Umberto does. I would put it in a more heterogenetic way. I would be more radical, maybe more an activist in some way. And I would say that narrativity is a Gestalt property that shapes perception and experience and makes our attunement to the environment possible. It's not an as if. It's a prior the shape perception and experience through meaning, through imagination. This is why the way in which we match the hallucination of imagination with the control of the world is through narrativity. It is the shape of the story that builds up the diagram we need in order to produce the next thread of our perceptual continuous flow. So thank you.
Claudio,
Sorry for the
merci.
English.
Merci beaucoup. Non, mais c'est en anglais scientifique qu'on peut comprendre. Oui. Merci beaucoup pour tes suggestions. La narrativité comme gestalt sémantique, très intéressant. Et surtout, je voulais dire, je ne veux pas poser une question, je veux laisser tout de suite la parole à la salle, mais je veux tout simplement dire que d'une certaine manière, ton intervention est très importante, surtout parce que tu abordes de manière directe, frontale, le problème de l'espace. Jacques Fontani, l'année dernière, quand on a déjà parlé beaucoup de diagrammes, il nous avait fait un peu, entre guillemets, une critique. Il nous avait dit, bah oui, effectivement, vous faites un bon travail sur les diagrammes spatials, c'est-à-dire que vous savez vraiment à partir de Peirce et d'autres, évidemment, Gilles Châtelet et d'autres, vous savez décrire finement désormais la relation entre l'objet à penser, l'objet à décrire et la manière dont le diagramme peut représenter ces relations qui peuvent être encore à venir, justement, des relations qui ne sont pas encore, je veux dire, qui sont virtuelles, comme tu l'as dit. Mais le temps, il est où, comment aborder le temps, etc. C'était un peu sa critique récurrente l'année dernière.
C'est le diagramme de temps.
Je pense que, oui, absolument. Quand tu as fait l'exemple des Adams, bon, je me suis dit, bon, c'est trop facile. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a un rythme des sons qui est facilement
dont on peut facilement imaginer la répétition. Donc, je me suis dit, bon, entre guillemets, simple parce qu'il y a déjà un rythme qui est enclenché et donc prévoir et reconnaître l'absence, la présence de l'absence, c'est facile dans ces cas-là. Mais tu as montré dans beaucoup plus tard, tu as montré que même là où il n'y a pas de rythme figé, disons,
aussi chez Adam, parce que c'est vraiment court. Ce n'est pas un très long pattern, c'est vraiment court.
Donc c'est ce que je voulais dire sur la question du temps. Évidemment, non, évidemment, ça reste entre guillemets, difficile à décrire, vraiment la description de cette temporalité, hein, je pense, parce qu'à chaque ouverture du futur, du next thread, des rythmes différents s'enclenchent parce que, évidemment, le monde change tout le temps et notre positionnement aussi. Bon. Donc, je voulais te remercier pour avoir abordé cette question qui était restée un peu dans l'ombre l'année dernière.
Mais il y a un jeune chercheur français qui est avec moi, qui peut nous aider à modéliser tout ça. Moi, j'étais hier à Lyon dans la soutenance de Claude Weiss. Lui, elle étudiait les déjà-vus. Et à partir du déjà-vu, il fait voir cette génération de diagrammes du temps. Il y a un très beau modèle. Alors, sa thèse est vraiment bien. Ça, c'est un premier modèle de ça. Ou modèle, c'est pas un modèle, c'est sémiotique du diagramme du temps. Et Claude Weiss.
Il vient de soutenir sa thèse.
Hier, il a soutenu. C'est une thèse à propos du déjà-vu, mais c'était vraiment bien. Lui, il a fait un travail sur cette mécanisme diagrammatique du temps.
Parce que le temps, je pense qu'on l'a un peu abordé, je pense que Noël est d'accord. On l'avait un peu abordé l'année dernière, bien sûr, mais vis-à-vis des représentations mathématiques, hein, de comment chaque traçage peut en enclencher un autre. Mais c'était toujours, disons, la perception vis-à-vis d'une représentation, c'est-à-dire notre perception des mathématiciens face à quelque chose qu'on est en train de construire. Donc, quand même, on était face à une textualisation, être face au monde et à l'environnement, c'est évidemment différent.
Nous, on l'avait abordé un peu, exposé sur l'installation,
Oui. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Oui, moi, j'aimerais être heureux d'avoir écouté ton intervention. C'est très beau comme la perception comme un art divinatoire.
C'est un peu comme ça.
Et non, je voulais juste te poser la question sur la narrativité. Est-ce que, je ne sais pas si on peut penser comme ça, donc la narrativité, le schéma, justement narratif, dire, serait une sorte de forme de la prédiction perceptive, tout simplement, mais ne serait-ce que par sa forme, justement, de schéma qui prévoit
Je ne sais pas si je mettrais les schémas dans les angles grémassiennes, quelque chose. Mais il y a, je suis tout à fait avec toi, Juan, et je me rappelle, parce que moi j'ai étudié avec Jean Petitot, je me rappelle que Jean disait quelque chose comme, je ne sais pas si tu m'aides, mais il disait que chez les humains, en quelque façon, la narrativité, c'est la façon de convertir les prégnances en salience. Parce que chez les animaux, ça c'est fait avec des formes. Mais chez nous, qu'on est différent, ça veut dire que la salience est en quelque façon une forme de traduction. Et c'est la narrativité. Et lui disait, la narrativité comme modèle textuel, je me rappelle, les gens disaient, c'était morphogénèse du sens, si je me rappelle bien, c'est en quelque façon quelque chose de trop simple pour faire de l'analyse textuelle, mais c'est super bien pour décrire cette machine humaine qui donne sens à la vie. C'est notre façon de donner sens à la vie. Alors, ce n'est pas du tout par hasard qu'on la retrouve dans la perception, parce que nous, quand on perçoit avec les corps, avec l'environnement, on délègue notre fonction cognitive au monde et au priors. Et on a vraiment, pas mal de données sur ça, qu'on a vraiment cette capacité de construire les percées à partir des connaissances précédentes. Alors, on n'attend pas le monde, on essaye.
Est-ce qu'il y en a d'autres, disons, lois, à part les lois narratives, disons, pour construire, pour
oui, il y
participer?
en a beaucoup. Il y a beaucoup. Sur ça, moi, je crois que la meilleure chose qu'on peut lire, c'est le livre par Andy Clark qui s'appelle Predictive Processing. Andy Clark, Surfing Uncertainty, c'est le livre. Là, il y a tout ce que tu demandes, parce qu'il y a, lui, fait un travail extraordinaire, parce que le livre est justement un projet IRC qu'il a gagné, alors il avait tout un team qui a fait un travail extraordinaire de tout ce qu'on connaît à un niveau expérimental, tout ça. Alors, si tu lis là, si tu vas lire ça, tu vois toutes les choses qui, en quelque façon, nous permettent de prendre position sur un modèle comme ça. Ça veut dire modèle de predictive processing, comme il appelle, ou d'hallucination contrôlée. Lui refuse un petit peu le moment proche, en quelque façon, un modèle presque inactif. Alors, moi, je dirais là.
Alors, je pense qu'il y a des questions. Alors, une seconde. Alessandro Sarti en présence. Il y a peut-être une question. Alors, de Bertrand Mesquelier, on donne une seconde la parole au distanciel. On fait normalement comme ça, c'est-à-dire que. Alors, faisons ceci. Bertrand Mesquelier, ensuite Alessandro, ensuite Aluminé. On a du temps, ne vous inquiétez pas. Ah, et puis il y a aussi une question de Pierluigi. Alors, Bertrand, Alexandre, Aluminé, puis Pierluigi. On fait comme ça. Je ne sais pas si Pierluigi, oui.
OK.
Bertrand, allez-y.
Je ne sais pas si vous... ma caméra ne marche pas très bien. Je voulais remercier...
On aimerait bien vous voir.
Oui, oui. J'essaye de mettre le...
On ne vous entend pas, hein, mais...
Et, bon, voilà. Est-ce que vous
mais je
m'entendez?
pense qu'il y a un problème. Oui, alors maintenant, on vous voit, Bertrand.
Et...
S'il vous plaît, essayez de parler.
D'accord. Est-ce que ça marche
si
là?
on n'entend rien, voyons un peu.
Est-ce que ça marche?
Voilà, essayez à nouveau.
Oui?
Oui, maintenant on vous entend.
D'accord, OK. Donc, j'ai beaucoup apprécié la présentation. Je suis en train de lire le livre, d'ailleurs, que je trouve tout à fait remarquable. Je voulais revenir pour faire une suggestion à l'exemple qui a été donné sur Peirce et la proposition « Every mother loves some child of hers ». Et je voudrais suggérer que ce qui apparaît comme une proposition avec la complexité de ses quantifications, etc., est aussi une narration, c'est même une histoire. Le mot « love » est au centre d'une énigme, en quelque sorte, qui repose sur toutes sortes de clues et de cues. Hein? Ah, d'accord. Et alors, mais je me suis posé la question, si on prend au mot, en quelque sorte, et là, je suis entièrement d'accord avec vous, que cet énoncé propositionnel est une narration, en quelque sorte, quelle est l'évidence, sur quelle évidentialité, en quelque sorte, sur quelle indexicalité est-ce que l'on peut énoncer ce petit récit en quelques mots? Et là, comme je suis anthropologue, je vais faire cette remarque. Dans les communautés rurales africaines que j'ai étudiées, on sait toujours qui est la mère de quel enfant. Les pères sont des pères par présomption. Il y a toutes sortes de moyens pour résoudre le problème d'attribution de la paternité à quelqu'un. Elle est en quelque sorte basée sur une certaine notion de contrat, pas nécessairement d'une évidence, je dirais, biologique. Et ce que je trouve assez intéressant, c'est que cette relation mère-enfant, donc la relation entre mother and child of hers, cette relation, elle repose sur le fait que l'accouchement est un accouchement, même s'il est privé, public, avec des témoins qui sont en mesure de témoigner du lien, je dirais, concret, charnel entre la mère et l'enfant nouveau-né. Et pour basculer très rapidement, parce que je ne veux pas prendre trop de temps, sur la dimension temporelle, il se trouve que dans ces sociétés sur lesquelles j'ai travaillé, il y a une notion de matrilinéarité, c'est-à-dire de temps généalogique, qui situe en quelque sorte toute personne dans cette société dans un espace-temps sociologique, en quelque sorte.
Merci vraiment, Bernard, pour tout ça, qui est vraiment, Bertrand, excuse-moi, très intéressant. Moi, je ne connaissais pas, mais c'est très bien. Et alors, je suis tout à fait avec vous aussi sur votre première partie, sur ce que vous avez dit. Et moi, j'aimerais bien ajouter et rappeler un peu que chez Peirce, la proposition est étudiée comme une petite scène. C'était la logique des relations. Et
Oui, oui.
alors, moi, je me rappelle, j'avais écrit un essai sur ça en montrant comme chez Peirce, la logique des relations, c'était ce que Lucien Teignard appelait la syntaxe attentielle. Ça veut dire que la phrase était une petite scène, c'était une scène prédicative en quelque façon. Alors, il y a toute une narrativité, toute une petite scène avec tout ce que vous avez dit, etc. Alors, c'est parfaitement dans l'esprit de Peirce aussi, pas seulement dans les miens. Voilà.
Et je voudrais ajouter quelque chose, puisque vous mentionnez Teignard, c'est que Vincent Descombes, dans sa lecture de Peirce, utilise Teignard comme linguiste en quelque sorte de la triadicité.
Voilà. Dans mon persona, Descombes, les institutions du sens, c'est une des sources et il fait un travail spectaculaire sur ça. Moi, j'adore ce livre-là. Je crois que cette connexion, alors je suis d'accord totalement avec vous.
D'accord, merci.
Mille merci Bertrand. Alors, je laisse la parole. Je demande d'être rapide parce que je voudrais entendre tout le monde. Donc, un peu de rapidité. Je l'ai dit pour toi aussi. Hein.
J'avais une question longue, mais... Like the conclusion, narrativity is a Gestalt property. Is a prior for meaningful configuration. And starting from here, I will like to go back from the beginning, meaning the Canizza triangle. And it's weird, so it's very interesting, actually. So the Canizza triangle is a Gestalt, too. But it's a Gestalt that is almost automatic. I mean, if we take pieces of the world, images from the world, and we make something automatic, something like a principal component analysis, harmonic analysis, and so on, we will find that the receptive profile of the cells of the primary visual cortex giving rise to the Canizza triangle. So we take these cells, this receptive profiles, we make a vibration, as you say, rightly, we make this hallucination, we make vibrate these cells, and we see also by a computer that the Canizza triangle emerges. So nothing to do with the body, nothing to do with something living, nothing to do with something that we can do. It's just formal, starting from the shapes of the world, images from the world. Also a robot sees the Canizza triangle. And of course, narrativity is a Gestalt property, something that go beyond the automatic processing, data processing and so on. And then we can ask why. So what is the difference between the controlled hallucination of the Canizza triangle that is an automatism and the narrativity as a Gestalt that is not automation, that is something that is heterogeneous and so on. So If we look at the receptive profiles of the cells in the primary visual cortex, with which we can say the Canizza triangle, we see that there are no pregnancies, just saliencies, meaning forms of the word. With the forms of the word, we are able to build up this virtual, that's really the virtual, no receptive profiles of the cells are the virtual. And when we make harmonic analysis and hallucination of this, we see the Canizza triangle. So I think that in between this case of the Canizza triangle, this automatic case, and the narrativity as a gestalt property, we have at least the inactive body, as you say, meaning the cinematic and the dynamic body, inactive in this sense. So you can graph, you can run, you can, but also the affective body, the affective body. In other sense, when from the scientific point of view, we cannot do anymore anything when we study cortices, when this affective body starts to enter in the building of the virtual, in the building of receptive profiles of the cell. We know that cells stays there just if they are inside two circuit of meaning for the affective body, for the inactive body. And if they are not inside circuit of meaning, they just are killed. They go off to the body. Then we don't know. So if we know how the virtual of the primary virtual cortex is built, we don't know anymore how the receptive profiles of cells are built in higher order cortices, because they are inside already of meaning circuits. Okay, it means from the heterogenetic point of view that we know how it is constructed the virtual in the primary visual cortex because we have just sciences, but we don't know anymore how they are built in higher order cortices because pregnancies are coming out. Okay, so we don't know anymore because they are inside circuits of meaning. Then I like so much your conclusion, narrativity as a gestalt property, because narrativity is a sort of circuit of meaning that is not just how to say something that is spoken, that is said externally to the body, but there is an internal narrativity of the body, an internal narrativity that give rise to the virtual, to make emerge all the forms of meaning. So narrativity is a narrativity of the external world, so as a prior for meaningful future configuration of the external world, but also of the internal world of the body. That's and all this is crucial for the building of the virtual of heterogenesis. It is exactly all the set of receptive profiles of cells that can contribute to the emergence of hallucination.
I will be very quick with my reply, which is only the request and the will to write the paper together on this topic, because this is something that I really care a lot about. So thank you, Alex.
No, thank you, beautiful.
Thank you.
Alors, je dois vous dire que Pierluigi, malheureusement, a dû nous quitter, donc ce ne sera pas la prochaine personne qui pourra poser une question. Alors, il est 5 heures, vous le voyez bien. Il y a 3 personnes qui veulent intervenir, Aluminé, Federico, Anne. Je laisserai exclusivement la parole, si ça ne vous dérange pas, à Aluminé qui a levé la main il y a un quart d'heure. Et puis, on peut peut-être continuer plus tard. Anne, est-ce que tu viens avec nous?
disait de Grémas, qui considérait que dans la passion, il y avait de bien plus puissant que le sujet. Il n'arrivait pas à se le figurer dans le dessin que vous avez montré tout à l'heure. Il y avait des choses qui lui auraient plu énormément. J'ai fait ce témoignage-là. Et le deuxième témoignage, nous avons fait une réunion à Royaumont où il y avait Petito, il y avait la ville, où il y avait tout le monde. Et il y avait John Searle. Et John Searle nous a donné finalement, non pas la communication qu'il a publiée, non pas la communication qu'il a faite devant nous, mais son texte sur la conscience, paru dans Intellectica en 2000, en considérant que tant qu'on ne pouvait pas répondre à ça, et en particulier à la position 1 de la conscience qui fait le 1, la conscience, qu'est-ce que c'est que la réflexion? Vous avez refusé de dire, tout à l'heure reconnaissance. Vous avez dit connaissance. On enlevait le re.
Oui, présentation et représentation.
Je vous demande de relire ce texte en fonction de tout ce que vous avez dit aujourd'hui et comment vous vous débrouillez avec le re.
Voilà. Merci, Anne. Je vais le faire.
Allumez très rapidement, s'il te plaît.
Oui, je ne sais pas où commencer parce que c'est génial. Merci beaucoup. Et surtout pas pour ma recherche. C'est pour ça que j'ai plein de questions pour toi. Donc, peut-être qu'on parlera après, mais je suis fascinée par la phase dont on n'attend pas le monde. Non? Et surtout, je pense à l'analyse de l'espace muséal où il y a évidemment cette gap d'avoir entre mes idées de cet espace, et déjà le futur de mon expérience expositive, je pense à l'avance, qu'est-ce que je vais expérimenter là-bas, et en mon temps, cette hallucination qui est contrôlée par moi-même, contrôlée par le monde, pour la laisser venir, mais aussi pour les arrêter, ça me questionne. Cette hallucination est contrôlée de cette double manière. Je me permets certaines hallucinations et j'arrête les autres hallucinations selon les genres d'expérience et les genres d'espace et les types de conduites, des comportements, des actions qui sont acceptés selon la situation où je me trouve, surtout dans les musées où l'apparition de l'art contemporain nous permet certaines choses, mais pas les autres. Et parfois, cette gap est beaucoup plus grande qu'elle était avant dans cette expérience en particulier.
Merci à l'univers pour tout ça. Et moi, juste un commentaire sur ça. Et ce mécanisme, bon, c'est un peu... ça marche pour aussi de petites choses en quelque façon. Non? Alors, l'idée qui est très intéressante de ce que tu es en train de dire, bon, la thèse que tu es en train d'écrire, c'est quelles sont les différences et les changements quand la perception est encadrée dans une pratique très complexe, en quelque façon. Alors, là, au niveau de la recherche, il faut voir, Alessandro avait déjà dit, non, les canisters tranquilles, c'est quelque chose c'est une alliance très automatique. Hein? Alors, quand je pensais à la narration comme Gestalt Property, ce n'était pas l'idée de canister triangle, mais c'était déjà l'idée du cube. Parce que le cube, tu dois faire des choses, parce qu'il y a deux, tu dois stabiliser. Et alors, ça c'est déjà différent, le cube et le canister triangle. Si tu vas prendre des situations très complexes comme une visite muséale, etc., c'est intéressant de voir comment les signifier, en quelque façon, la structure des pratiques va intégrer tout ça, et comme la perception, en quelque façon, donne forme à tout ce qui se passe autour d'elle. Dans mon point de vue, ça, c'est seulement ce que je peux dire, mais merci pour toi, pour ta question.
On va clôturer la séance. Je m'excuse, Federico, mais bon, tu resteras avec nous ce soir. Mille merci encore, Alessandro, Claudio. Mille merci à vous. Et merci aussi à nos assidus participants distanciels. Il y en a certains qui sont vraiment assidus, certains
que je vois pour la première fois. On se verra donc le 11 janvier prochain avec les interventions de Didier Tsala et Yvan Darro. Donc, soyez fidèles au 11 janvier. Ciao, ciao.
Merci beaucoup, Maria Giulia.
Merci.